climate, gender, race. The issues that really matter to the California left are those issues. We're teaching these kids young communist league kind of propaganda, and they can't read and write, and they don't know any history. We had an incident just the other day in LA where a bunch of protesters blocked entrance to a synagogue. And of course somebody said, well, what would have happened if they had blocked the entrance to a mosque? Well, we want California to have low admissions. Tell me, how are we doing anything better if concrete is made in Arizona or Mexico and shipped in? How is that conceivably better? I think there is a struggle inside the Democratic Party, and Hispanics are also moving to the right.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and we have something very exciting for you today. I'm going to be in conversation with the brilliant Joel Kotkin. He's come all the way over from America. Hello, Joel.
Hi.
So Joel is a Spiked columnist. He's written also a brilliant book called The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, which I really want to touch on some of the themes of that today. I mean, Joel, you're from California. You've written a lot about how California used to be almost like a model of liberty and economic dynamism, and it's now the opposite. It's almost like a kind of warning to the world as to what can happen if we don't sort of stand up to sort of crazy elite ideas of our time. I mean, for people who aren't aware, can you just give us a sense of how bad things have got in California? Why it's this warning?
Well, here we can start with highest poverty rate, highest, lowest job creation, highest unemployment, huge budget deficit, massive migration. And I'm originally from New York, but I am a total California nationalist. You have to really screw it up to chase people out of California. I mean, it's the most beautiful place probably in the world. It's got certainly the best climate. I mean, there may be other places that are more scenic, but they're not located in major cities.
Yeah.
I mean, the way that, and what's interesting is this is not just a product of the Democrats taking power, because much of what made California great was done by Pat Brown,
right?
Who was the former governor. We had a great political system. You read J.K. Galbraith, and they'll say California had the most efficient state government in the country. Today, it was ranked 50th.
Yeah,
I mean, essentially, what California is, if you stop diversifying your economy so you're only reliant basically on IPO capital gains. I mean, that makes it or breaks it. And when that isn't going well enough, or the people collecting capital gains have decided to move to Nevada where there's no income tax, you have a huge negative. And then every insane idea has been planted, like they're telling the stores, you have to have transgender clothes for kids. They just passed a law where they said you can't, and this is not my big issue. I focus more on economics, but they'd have these policies where, like if you're a parent and your kid is talking to the teacher about wanting to transition, you can't tell you that you're not allowed to tell the parent.
Yeah.
I'm a parent. I'd be really pissed if I heard something like that and they decided that, very important decisions, particularly if they're made by very young children. So there's all that. And then the biggest thing that's driving what's happened to California has been this insane green policy. Yeah.
So, Joel, you've described California as almost like being neo-feudal.
Right.
Feudal system. It's got a nobility, a sort of clericy, and the serfs. I mean, who are those groups today? And
right.
How do they fit into
Of course, California? The sad thing is they don't have that in schools, at least in the United States. So you get a bunch of college students and talk about feudalism. I might as well be talking about the latest, microbial strain on Mars. So, but I think here's how I see it. One, you have a class, the oligarchs, who are very much like the barbarians who came in after the end of the Roman Empire and seized everything. And, give them credit to some extent. Some of them were really smart. Some of them were lucky. Some of them had access to money. But think about these companies, the five biggest companies.
Tech companies.
These are tech companies, 5 biggest tech companies, 6 biggest tech companies, 4 of whom are in California. There is money being made there that we haven't seen at any period, maybe in the Gilded Age. I'm not sure we even saw that. So that's sort of my idea of the aristocracy. And we live in a country where the stock market lives and dies on 7 companies. So, you're almost like afraid to say anything bad about them. Then you have what I think is underestimated, which is the Theclaricy. And that's used to be like in France, they would be the first estate. Yeah. And, they're the ones who say, this can be discussed, this can't be discussed. You read the newspapers. I mean, sometimes I remember in the California migration, Wendell Cox and I we were looking at the numbers and saying, well, look, there's all these people leaving. There's a big net out. The media fought us on that for 10 years. Yeah. It's just temporary. People really aren't leaving. Anyway, the people who are leaving are poor and stupid, which is the good line from progressives. And so I think what's happened is that the universities have, to a large extent, been completely taken over. Yeah. Compared to when I went to Berkeley, which was a long time ago, we had conservative professors. We had, traditional liberal professors. Now it's very difficult in certainly the social sciences and humanities to be anything other than a progressive. So they have that. And then you basically have what I call the yeoman class, which are still the people who own property, own businesses, have, in some cases, have, some money that they've made and that they control. That class is being shrunk down, and many of them and their children are becoming serfs. And by the way, you have weird forms of serfdom. You have couples making a good living, but they're never going to own a house. They're never going to have kids. They're never going to go into what we call middle class lifestyles, and they tend to be very much part of this group, which is much larger, which includes a lot of poor people, particularly minorities in California. California is about 40% Hispanic, and although some Hispanics have been making great progress, a lot of them are just stuck because they came to California to be part of a diversified economy and are now left with an economy which really, it generates a few very high-tech jobs, very little in manufacturing, very little in logistics, very little in agriculture. So all the businesses that Latino immigrants went into have been systematically undermined. And so you end up with high poverty rates and people living in extremely crowded housing. I mean,
there's a real irony there, isn't there? That, ostensibly California probably has what people might describe as the most left-wing or progressive government, but it has, on the one hand, this outrageous sort of wealth, super rich that you've never seen before. The worst poverty, and particularly minorities, as you suggested, are in poverty, despite all these kinds of this obsession really with racial justice. I mean, how do people square that circle?
Well, first of all, we have to understand what are the priority issues of the progressive left: climate, gender, race. Yeah, they're not distribution of income. Now, there are some old lefties who I feel more sympathy for. Yeah. I think their suggestions may not be great, but they understand what the fundamental problem is. But the issues that really matter to the California left are those issues. And a very important issue is, and they almost are part of the Theclaricy, is the public employee unions. They are the most powerful political force in the state. That's why the state education system, which was once one of the best, is now one of the worst. And of course, what do the upper class people care? Because they send their kids to private school, and the sort of hip professionals don't have kids. So, and if they have kids, guess what? They move to Nevada, they move to Arizona, they move to Texas. I mean, if you look at who's moving, that's who's moving. The only people who can stay very often are those who may inherit a house, which is sort of what I'm hoping my daughters will do.
And on the question of race, California has probably gone further than anywhere else, imaginable. There's discussions about reparations, potentially of millions of dollars per, minoritized person.
Billions of dollars.
Billions. Well, per person.
Oh, yeah.
Millions.
Like in 6 figures.
Yeah.
Now, here's the ultimate absurdity. California was never a slave state. the biggest count, they took maybe 2,000 or 3,000 slaves before in that period between when the state got rid of Mexico and became part of the United States, but it came in as a free state. The only case of slavery in California was Native Americans, and that bill should go to Madrid.
Yeah,
I mean,
and yet there's this, huge. Essentially, San Francisco saying everyone will get their own house, everyone will get their own, as a six-figure sort of stipend, just to.
And as people say, wait a minute, do you think the Hispanic people who are coming and trying to make it their way and have faced discrimination? And by the way, if you know the history of California, the Asians are the ones who actually had the worst discrimination.
Yeah,
because the whites in the 1850s, 60s, 70s were more worried about the Asians, not just because they were racially different, but because they outcompeted them. They didn't like that.
Yeah. I mean, they're considered white now, aren't they? In the sort of American racial discourse by some of the woke.
White adjacent.
White adjacent.
And of course, part of what, we were talking about earlier, which is, they're talking about, well, we're going to have DEI for Muslims. Well, in the United States, Muslims are doing better than whites too.
Yeah.
Because very different than what you have, let's say, in the continent. We don't have large numbers of people who snuck in, who are poor. Most of the Muslims coming to the U.S., a lot of them own businesses. A lot of them went to school. And look, my own assistant is Iranian Muslim. So, the idea that California has this particular need to single out one group when there have been so many groups that have had prejudice. I couldn't have lived in the house I live in now 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So what am I supposed to do? Well, I was discriminated against. I mean, it's this whole notion, the settler colonial stuff imposed on California, which makes no sense because California didn't have any people. I mean, it was pretty empty in the 1840s, a very small population.
Yeah.
And the idea that somehow this is, you give a speech and you got to say, well, this land was owned by the so-and-so group and we're just borrowing it basically. I mean, if things get twisted into this sort of almost impossible rhetorical trap, where, you can't say this and you can't say that. And meanwhile, the real problems, like I'm more concerned about the kids' scores on math and reading than I am about whether they get taught that, all white people have white privilege, including, and I tried to make the point, well, what about the Irish Catholics in the 1850s? I mean, they had discrimination too. I mean, this idea that we're teaching these kids all this sort of young communist league kind of propaganda, and they can't read and write, and they don't know any history. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to, if a student wants to discuss, the history of racism or something, but they should know something about history. Yeah. And they don't. That's for sure.
And there's definitely one form of racism that has a big blind spot when you're talking about woke people, and I'm sure it's the same in California, and that's obviously anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a bit about some of the sort of goings on recently?
Yeah, I mean, California is very unique in the history of Jews, which is, something I wrote about. It was the chapter I wrote on it was called Jews in Paradise. And it was the ideal place for Jews to go because there was no establishment when they got there. They didn't have to push their way past a bunch of, Anglo-Saxon, oligarchs because there was nothing there. I mean, what I'm wearing here is developed by a Jewish businessman, Strauss. Hollywood was invented. The earliest people who did some of the big development, particularly in Southern California, were Jewish. It was always a state where you felt very comfortable being Jewish. I mean, where the discrimination that wasn't something you dealt with. And the fact that that's turned in the last few years, and certainly the last 6 months, is
Yeah.
we had an incident just the other day in LA where a bunch of protesters blocked entrance to a synagogue.
Mm.
And of course somebody said, well, what would have happened if they had blocked the entrance to a mosque?
Yeah. I think almost doesn't bear thinking about. I mean,
Right.
It's just the sort of double standards that you see there. I did want to talk about one of the things you mentioned earlier. One of the really important sort of things to our elites is the obsession with the climate. That is obviously a particularly big problem in Europe, but I'd say in America, it seems to be California that is most affected.
Yeah, California has always set up its own policy. And I was looking at the policies that they're talking about, and I say, you're talking within 2-3 years that 50% of the cars will be electric.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just no way that could possibly happen. So what it's going to do is drive up the price of gas-powered cars. And by the way, we just bought a car last weekend. We bought a hybrid, and the salesman said, "I can't keep a hybrid on the lot." He said, "EVs, I got plenty of those." And so what you're seeing is enormous distortions. Like one of the most insane things they'll say, well, we want California to have low emissions, but we're still going to consume the products that cause the emissions.
Yeah.
So tell me, how are we doing anything better if concrete is made in Arizona or Mexico and shipped in? How is that conceivably better than doing it here or in California? Or take oil. We have a huge amount of oil, which we don't use. So what do? We get oil from the Saudis.
Yeah.
I mean, on ships, going enormous distances. And we've done some work on this. And one of the things we see is whatever California's saving, it's losing by what we call leakage. In other words, and the same thing is very much true here in the UK. UK, likes to, say how great they are. Well, they're great because you don't make anything. I mean, one of the most difficult things I always find going to England is there's nothing to buy that is made here.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, California did used to make things, presumably, these policies, green policies pushing up electricity prices, energy prices. That means it's not competitive to make things,
Well, and then there are all sorts of other labor laws and things that are difficult. But if you're in any industry that requires reliable, cheap energy, you're in big trouble. Logistics, which is a very heavily Latino, working class, upwardly mobile occupation. It's getting wiped out. They're saying, "Oh, you're going to have to do everything with electricity." Well, nobody has developed a big rig that runs on electricity. And if you developed it, you'd have to keep stopping. And, in that business, it's all about speed, how fast you get the product to market. There's a lot of energy used in, almost any industrial process. So, what we end up with is Hollywood, which is declining as well, which is a whole nother topic. And the software end of the tech business. You take NVIDIA. Yeah. NVIDIA gets, I think, 7% of its revenues from sales inside the United States. It manufactures nothing in the United States. So the only people working there are a bunch of, chip designers who are paid very well. Yeah. But meanwhile, because I've been working a lot on AI, as AI comes in, it's actually decreasing tech employment. Right. Because if it's just a software issue, the AI can do a lot of that software.
And is there anything we can do to sort of push back, or are there any sort of shoots of hope for people pushing back politically, or do people just think they should just leave this state? Because, a lot of these things, as we've said, are happening elsewhere. Maybe California's just further down the path.
Well, I think that there are some really interesting things going on. One, I think there is a rebellion against sort of the lawlessness, the homeless issues. And so we saw in San Francisco, of all places, a big move against against very radical district attorneys who don't want to put anyone in jail or avoid it like the plague. there was San Francisco got rid of some of the school board members who were really out there and, on some other planet. And there was an attempt to force affirmative action, and it was voted down.
Yeah.
And it was voted down. Hispanics split, whites were against it, Asians were like 70% against it. So that people of color coalition is sort of beginning to shatter. And I think there's a real move, is something that, we'll be talking about it, in the magazine is I think there is a struggle inside the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of pushback going on. Even in the Senate race, there were 2 anti-Israel candidates, 1 pro-Israel candidate won. I think that there will be also, I think, signs in California that Hispanics and to some extent Asians are also moving to the right.
Yeah.
And I think reparations is the perfect way to make that happen. I mean, you think about it. You emigrated from Mexico 30 years ago. You work like a dog. You finally own a house. Your kids are going to college, and you faced all sorts of discrimination. And then somebody else says, "Well, because my great great grandfather was a slave." I mean, we've got to remember, this is 1865, I mean, it's, so I think that there are signs of things happening, but the negative part, and this is what, actually the Republican National Committeeman for California and I talked about this, and he said, it's migration. The people leaving the state tend to be families, people in their 30s, 40s, early 50s, and many of them are more conservative. And as he said, Texas is taking all my voters. That's why this whole idea that when the blue people were going to move to the red states, that the red states would become blue, didn't quite happen because they were a self-selected group.
Yeah, people are voting with their feet, I guess.
They're voting with their feet. And at the stage of life, where, you're making a decent living, but the cost of living is too high. You don't want to pay that much in taxes, and you want to buy a house.
But there's hope.
There's hope. I mean, California is not gone yet. It has so much going for it. I mean, locationally, in terms of weather, in terms of innovation, but it's definitely what's changed. I would say in the last 40 years, is states like Florida and Texas are beginning to sort of move and take a lot of what California used to be.
Yeah.
I remember being, I had a speaking engagement in Sarasota, Florida, and I was walking along the little boardwalk area, and I said, you know what? These are the same people who came to LA in the 1970s.
Yeah.
But they don't come to LA anymore. California is near the bottom in attracting new people. Even immigrants aren't coming. LA County has fewer foreign-born people today than it did in 2010.
Right.
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah. Well, hopefully we can sort of stave off the decline there, but also everywhere else, around the world that we're
the lesson of California is very important because it gets adopted by other people. I mean, how anyone can talk about Gavin Newsom as a serious candidate for president, given what's happening, is just. But again, if you can have a buffoon like Trump and a cadaver, I don't know what else you can do.
Joel Kotkin, thank you very much.
Thank you.